It's time to introduce our first guest speaker, John Hammant, who leads the compute business for Amazon Web Services in the UK and Ireland. And as part of his role, he leads a number of businesses, including EC2, modern applications, Graviton, containers and servers, and networking. John has worked in the world of tech for many years, starting out programming on his BBC Micro at age 3. John, thanks for joining me. I'm curious about this BBC Micro. Why haven't I heard of it?
It was it's genuinely one of the best computers you could get. So for the Brits out there, I'm sure a lot of them will know it. It was so randomly the BBC TV company effectively launched a computer to help people program, and it was one of these things that I thankfully started playing about with when I was 3. I still remember writing "Hello World" before my 4th birthday, and then getting to finally getting to the point where I could take input and move it around. So yeah, found my love computing then, and have done it ever since, honestly.
You are doing a screen share if you want to bring that up.
Yeah,
once that works.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for your time. So I suppose just a brief chat through some modern compute and optimization pieces within AWS. To be relatively brief, but hopefully give an idea of some of the things that really we've been helping a bunch of customers with, and give you some easy ways of optimizing around AWS. Background for me, as John very kindly introed me, so I lead the compute business for UK and Ireland for AWS. I've been within it for about 2.5 years, and my background before, I've worked in the world of IT for longer than I would like to admit, in all honesty, and that's everything from running DevOps over at Accenture. I used to run infrastructure for all of Standard Chartered, and I've managed big systems, managed small systems, technically hands-on, so kind of been there, done a bunch of stuff. So briefly, what we'll go through in the next few minutes is an overview to the exciting subject that is cloud financial management, and it is a lot more interesting than it sounds, and it's one of those topics that people go with, but it's really, really key to what people want to do. And I think without really sound financial management of the cloud, you're not going to have a good time. We'll go a bit into how optimizing cloud usage. I'll give some practical approaches around that, some tips to get started, and some things that you can do now. And I suppose one of the key things I want to put in this, as well as optimizing spend, one of the reasons that I really am passionate about this is it's optimizing sustainability. We want to get to a situation where you use less resources because, 1, it costs you less money, and 2, it's just better for the environment overall. So they really do go hand in hand. I've really encouraged people to think, as they look at things like net zero, about carbon decrease, to actually start looking at optimizing as being the start of it. And I suppose, into the introduction of where this goes, I think the key thing that I want to leave is with our founder, Jeff Bezos. And he really said there's 2 kinds of companies within that. There's the ones that try to charge more, and there's ones that try and charge less. And really, I'm very proud of the fact that I think Amazon is one of those in the second piece. We've seen our prices reduce year after year after year. When I look at the team of folk that I have, one of the things I really like about my role is none of us are quoted. We're not trying to make people spend more money. Actually, what we're trying to do is have long-term relationship with customers where you get better outcomes. And a lot of the time, actually, that means trying to reduce people's bills. One of the things that I think is quite unique about the cloud is this ability to effectively align incentives. So getting to a point where, really the better that companies do, the better that everyone does at the same time. If I think back to IT of old, it was really about selling. We'd have vendors come in, they'd sell licenses. The idea would be to sell a large license and then disappear off for the next 12 months. And we are completely the opposite there. So for us, we need customers to be successful, and we want them to grow. Some of our biggest success stories are companies that take the likes of Netflix or Deliveroo, companies that have grown up with us, and we've done that by making sure that they use the cloud in the correct way. So what is cloud financial management? So I suppose there's a few pillars that really fit into it. And that comes into a number of key things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to see, you need to be able to save money around it, you need to be able to plan, you have to be able to run around it. So what are those? So seeing it is that measurement and accountability. So one of the things that's happened within the cloud, this ability to have this infinite elastic scaling, is really, really important to be able to measure what you're doing and understand why you're doing it. So, that measurement side of that. And there's many different tools that we give around it. There's Cost Explorer. I'll go into a bunch of these and give some links to them later. But there's a bunch of these things around it where there's pre-done tools that you can use that really give you that visibility into it. F1's using CloudWatch metrics. There's some great open source stuff out there as well, like KubeCost, depending on what you're doing. But, the key thing, if you want to do this first, is you need to be able to measure it. And then the accountability piece is key as well. You need to be able to understand who has caused that cost. Depending on how you do it, depending on the maturity of your organization, how do you take those costs and try and charge them back? It's one of the key things. Saving. The key thing is looking at what you're spending. How do you optimize that for cost? And there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that, whether that's either the ways that you procure cloud, the ways that you run it. But it's really key that you make sure you see it, you save it. And then it's the planning. It's working out, no one wants to get to a situation where there's unexpected cost shock coming up. So how do you look at what's been spent previously and start to move into the future to work out how we're going to be able to forecast that, how we have to optimize around that forecasting itself, and how we're going to run that into the future. And it's a really important thing because elasticity and on-demand instances are absolutely fine, and we have customers that use those to huge advantage. But as you start going into a point where you have more stable workloads, or you have some workloads which are stable, some which aren't, the more you can plan that, the more you can effectively commit to some of those pieces, the more you can have that longer term distance. So as well as optimize for the now, it's about thinking about where this will go in the future. And then finally, there's the run side of it. All of this is running mission critical, large scale systems. But we're completely aware that businesses depend on us. And so it's really important to think about how you run this on a day-to-day basis, how it comes back. And that for us is really where cloud financial comes in. So why is it important to optimize cloud usage? Well, there's a bunch of reasons around this. Fundamentally, if you're not running optimized cloud, then you're kind of really starting to miss a trick. There are so many different ways that you can do it. It's key to be successful. We don't want people using resources when they don't need to. Be really clear with this. We try and do all we can to try and optimize around it. And there's a few pillars that sit around it. So if I look at the 5 pillars that we would say around cost optimization, the first one, making sure that you right size and modernize your instances, making sure you've not got things too big. I remember back into the world of IT that I previously lived in, and it was just a matter of, you would get a DL380, a DL580. They were relatively standardized things. AWS isn't like that now. There's, I think, 500 plus instances. So there's very, very granular control, granular detail you can go to get in the right instance side. So that becomes really, really important. You can increase your elasticity. Part of the advantage of not running it in your own data center is the fact that you're not limited by effectively how much you can scale up and down. It depends on your workload, obviously, but one of the key things is being able to do that balance in elasticity going through. So it's really key to think about that. If for certain people, I remember years ago, I used to work in the world of e-gaming. We'd look at certain large sporting events or horse races, and we'd just stack huge amounts of equipment up for it. The key thing with the cloud is you can have this elasticity around it. And then it's leveraging the right pricing model. Like people don't seem to always realize actually there's all kinds of different ways to procure AWS services. And that's both in terms of the way that you rent the servers, both in terms of the way that you procure per demand, in terms of things like EDP. So if you start spending large amounts of money, there's all kinds of interesting discussions you can get from upfront commitments that go through. Also storage. So we find storage is something that really isn't thought of enough. Looking at AWS, there's all kinds of interesting ways that you can tier and you can optimize your storage to kind of really drive that price down. And again, so much of that, we're trying to get to a situation where it's automated, so where that's intelligent tiering, looking at actually your life cycling policies. One of the interesting things around storage is about 68% of all data that's stored is never used. And that's not used once and chucked away. That is just literally never used. So about 60% on average of data is never used. So it's really important to think about how you can optimize that. It wouldn't be an Amazon presentation without the kind of flywheel approach that sits around all of this. And the key thing is to constantly measure this, constantly monitor it, and constantly improve it by having this looping background. Are the instances the right size? How can you increase the elasticity? How can you optimize the price model? How can you optimize your storage? And make sure all of this is going around. Looking at how do we see people typically do this journey? Well, it's kind of interesting. Normally what we see is this first move when we compare the TCO. The first is our on-prem. So what often happens is people, they have an on-prem environment, large, and they'll go to this point where actually what they want to do is they want to lift and shift this into the cloud. And it's kind of interesting. We're hearing more and more people talk about lift and shift, or lift, shift, and tinker, where you move the thing over and you start to do some interesting things at first. And that's one thing I'd really recommend for folk. If you've just lift and shifted your workloads, really start to try and think about how can you do those next steps around it. Because that's where you start to get some of these advantages coming in. What are the next things that we would recommend? None of these are particularly complex, but there's some really good advantage you can get through. The first one, it is very, very likely that the stuff you've had on-prem has not been the correct size what you want to run. So just going through and initially right-sizing those instances is really, really key. You can make some significant advantages by doing that at first. Second one is the improved elasticity. So as soon as you start to get to this point where you can right size, actually it's looking at what can we start, what can we stop, what can we bring up, and how can we look around our demand shaping in our curve. And that can be, I'll go into it from as simple as, well, we have no developers in on the weekend, so there is no point running the dev cluster on the weekend, to starting to go to interesting pieces around how we move up to peak, how we automatically expand them. Storage optimization, again, a very big thing. Going to a point where we can go to intelligent tiering, and the piece that sits around that is absolutely key. And then we can kind of start to move on to it. So then we kind of get to this optimized lift and shift. So stuff's almost the same as it was when you were on-prem, but it's started to be optimized slightly. And then if we go through, we can start to build these economic cases through optimization. As we get along this piece, can really start to reduce this TCO. And that's measuring and monitoring, managed services, flipping OSs. That's one of the big things that we see. There's a lot of workloads that are running on Windows. Windows licenses are really expensive. That's just the reality of it. And there's so much flexibility in moving some of those things over. And that's really starts to take this curve down. And then we can kind of get all interesting stuff at the end. We can go into serverless. We can use more managed services. And this is really where you start to get the value out of the cloud. Now, if people take one thing from it, you do not get good value. There is no, the benefits are hard to achieve when you just do a straight lift and shift. So I'd really recommend everyone, as you look through this, look at what you can optimize in that first piece of the thing, and then look at how you can continue that journey through and really getting to a point where you start to drive value. And it's how we want to help. There are huge amounts of resources. We want to help people go through this journey, and ideally we've put a bunch of tools in, a bunch of things around it to help this. And so I'll give some practical approaches, so things that you can take away. And ideally, I'm going to give 5 different approaches out of this. What I'd love everyone to do, and I suppose what would make me a really happy person, would be if you just look through this and just take one approach of it. Don't do, if you want to do all 5, fantastic, but just pick one. And if everyone on this call, I think we had about 240 people on this call, if everyone on this call picked one, or even 50% have picked one, there's significant, both in terms of cost savings for all you folk, but more than anything, there's some really good sustainability benefits. The most sustainable systems we can have are ones that just aren't being used or aren't being switched on. Other people will use that capacity that comes through. So the more that we can get to a situation with oil, the better it is for the planet. So, the key thing is we want to optimize our workloads. And that's, as I said before, it's 475 instances. It's making sure you've got that correct combination of CPU, memory, storage, networking capability. So, really don't just by default fire up a large AWS instance. Think about what size you want. If you're still using EC2 VMs, you're not running containers or all that side of things, really think about what actually is needed from them. And there's a bunch of options we have. There's all of a sudden we've got more and more instances come through. There's going to be more and more specialization definitely coming in the future. You can see interesting stuff that we've done through all kinds of new instances around. And it's really looking at how do you best support that? What do you actually need through it? And then I suppose if I look at the things to take away, so what are the things that you can do today? So you might think, that's a bit hard, but let's think of a first step actually to optimize that we can all do today. And the simple one is stop paying for idle instances. That is probably the easiest thing that anyone on this can do. You will have EC2 instances that are running out of office hours, and all of this needs to be checked. Make sure that you're not switching off production systems. I'm sure you've all got the correct amount of config management and testing within it. But it's really key to look at those and see what can you switch off and what can you start. And we've had a tool that helps you do that. So we have the AWS Instance Scheduler. You can see there's a QR code in that. I can provide links later. But with that, you can really start to create those schedules based on your requirements. Tag the non-prod EC2 instances to be scheduled. Now, be really clear. This isn't stuff you want to do to prod. But if you look at your dev environments, if you look at your CI environments, it's really, really key. It's a really easy thing to do. So if you're getting to a situation where you're just going to switch off stuff for the weekend, or you're going to switch off stuff for out of hours on the weekend, you can get some quite good cost savings. And it's really quite easy to do. So depending on what you need, and getting to a situation where you don't switch the thing off completely, scaling these down to scaling down your dev clusters, scaling down some of your stuff around it that no one's doing. The complexity is low and the upside is really quite impressive. So we want an assumption here that you're taking down Monday to Friday, effectively taking off on the weekends. You look like 35%, and that's literally just for the weekend. If you think people aren't working in the dead of night every day, start shutting things down. People, depending on how you set it up, you can get to a point where you use Lambda, you put a self-service, people can start these back up, but going to a point where when stuff isn't needed, you just don't run it. Is really the easiest one to do. So I'd recommend everyone take a look at AWS Instance Scheduler. Hopefully that'll have some of the details around it. Next, so one of the things that we sometimes talk to people about savings plans and reserved instances, and it's one of these things that sometimes it's a hard conversation, because I think people like the fact with AWS that it is on demand, that you can spin things up, you can spin things down, and that's fine. We are happy for people to do that. However, being clear, the flexible purchase options, you pay lower rates in exchange for agreed usage commitment around it. And if I look at how the typical workloads work for a lot of our customers, there will be a base level of compute that is required with peaks and troughs sitting around it. So the key thing for that is to work out, well, if I'm going to use this thing all the time, it can be dramatically cheaper, sometimes up to about 72%, to actually reserve some of those in advance, depending on how long your projects are going. That's from months to some of the longer ones are in much longer times than that, I think in a number of years. But really going to that point where you can start to use those savings plans, those reserved instances. It's not that hard. I would say the implementation is hours, but again, there's really significant savings that are available through this. We've provided tools to see how to do it. So AWS Cost Explorer is fantastic for it. It does recommendations as to what you should do. You can literally click through and see the recommended reserve. So take a look at that. We've got a savings plan calculator. There's a link to on there. But as I say, it's things that are quite easy to do. There is commitment around it, but realistically, when you see what's been happening in a lot of infrastructure, especially large organizations, the people will be doing that. Using RIs is one of the best ways to save things, which is fantastic. And then we go into some of the other options we have around it. So Graviton, there's
John, I got to jump in there real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to actually cut you off, but I want to give time to some of the Q&A sessions, and then to some of the other speakers. Everybody, to let you know, John, will these slides be available?
Yeah, I can definitely put these up.
Awesome. So everybody, I apologize. John's not going to be able to finish some of the Graviton stuff, but this is valuable information. I want to share with everybody. And then we have some questions that came in from the audience. What would be your top advice for people looking to optimize compute in AWS? And this might be a good Graviton question, but that's just me.
Yeah, I think really it's a matter of working out what you think is the quickest way to get there. And I think it's going through, it's switching off what isn't there first. It's definitely the best way of doing it. And then I think one of the most efficient ways we have is Graviton by a long way. We look about 40% price performance benefits. It's really, really easy to move over to, in all honesty. We find, especially if you're running things like Python, if you're running Node, if you're running Java, it's a really, really easy thing. So I'd really recommend people spin that up and do it. The other thing we see massive benefits are for Spot. One of the strangest things I've seen over the years, we'll have people that have used Chaos Monkey and Chaos Engineering to build their infrastructure, and then we'll say, well, yeah, perfect. So you're going to run that on Spot. You're going to run that on something where that's kind of in place. And no, we're not going to do that. It might go, and you kind of think, actually, if you're going to design things for failure and design it for all that good stuff, take advantage of it. Take advantage of the cheaper prices that come through compute with it.
I agree with you. I think if you're building something already that somebody's going to have some chaos for failure, why not go with Spot instances? Because even though they can be pulled out with you will have your notifications. They've increased it. You can pull some API. There's some great tools out there. Why not utilize it? Get 70% of savings for Spot instances, and
we've open sourced. I'd recommend everyone to take a look at Carpenter if they haven't already. It's a project that we've open sourced recently. It's really good, and it makes the whole process of effectively managing Spot instances in your Kubernetes clusters dramatically easier. And I'll send a link over into the chat for folk.
Awesome. So John, I got time for one more question. What are some of the typical issues you see when people are trying to optimize their compute?
Yeah, I think people are scared of it sometimes. I think sometimes people don't realize it's one of those really weird things. It's like, if I think about backing up files, it always feels like it's easier to back up files more and more times. And actually, it's far scarier saying, well, I'm gonna cut things down. And I think sometimes we find that with people optimizing, it just feels scarier to use less of something sometimes rather than just using more. So I think a lot of it ends up being fear. But the advice is, we've gone through this with so many different people, so successful, and that the more that you reach out for help for AWS, we have loads of solution specialists that want to help with this. Yeah, it really is. It's one of those things. It's the first step is the hardest, and then the more you can do it, the better.
I like Luciano's comment. We're hoarders at best, even with cloud resources. The thing that I think of, John, is that a lot of us who are in cloud have been doing some type of IT work for a long time, and we're so used to provisioning resources at max amount of value because you know what, we didn't pay for them on premises, and understanding it into the cloud infrastructure and the flexibility. Yes, we had load balancers then, but we could do it with always on instances, and now with cloud, it provides flexibility for us to actually spin them up immediately, and as resources are needed, they're there. If not, take them away and do your cost savings. Why give everything at once? And we always over provision on the instance types. I've never seen everybody so accurate on actually doing it unless they've benchmarked it and tested it and then provisioned.
Totally agree.
I enjoyed this and following along with it. The slides were excellent. We will provide it. The emojis are flying in. I got some thumbs up. You know what? I'm going to give you a thumbs up there and a high five for it. John, I really appreciate the conversation. There's always more down the road.